Tier 1. The Milgram Shock Experiment. Although this study is officially called the Milgram Experiment, Milgram himself referred to it as an examination of the perils of obedience, and you're about to see why. The experiment began in August 1961, at a time when everyone was discussing whether or not the Nazi war criminals were accomplices or simply men and women following the orders of their superiors. Among the people involved in this discourse was psychologist Stanley Milgram. Instead of just airing his opinion and calling it a day, Milgram took things at least 1,000 steps further. He devised a series of social psychology experiments to get answers. The study aimed to see how willing people were to follow orders from an authority figure, even when those orders went against their own morals. The participants were led to believe they were helping a learner improve their memory by administering punishment in the form of electric shock whenever the learner got an answer wrong. The kicker is that the shocks would increase in intensity every time until it reached fatal levels. In a not-so-shocking turn of events, many of the participants went on delivering the shocks even after the learner began to show signs that they were hurt and in pain. In reality, the learners were paid actors and the shocks weren't real. But if they were, let's just say nearly all the participants would have blood on their hands simply because an authority figure prompted them to do so. Although no one was physically hurt during this experiment, a lot of people still got mad at Milgram because A, he kind of lied to the participants about what they were there for, and B, many participants showed signs of tension and stress. They were willing to deliver the shocks, but that doesn't mean they enjoyed doing it. False memory implantation. Imagine going on for just another regular therapy session and walking out of the consultation room with a new set of not-so-great memories that never existed. This is called false memory implantation. And yeah, it's as bad as it sounds. Developed in the 1990s, false memory implantation was a technique used in cognitive psychology to investigate human memory. It was supposed to provide evidence of how easily people's memories of past events could be distorted. At the start, the false memories that were implanted in people included stuff like being lost in the mall as a child, taking a hot air balloon ride, and putting slime in a teacher's desk in primary school. But as with pretty much every other novel scientific discovery, someone was going to misuse it sooner or later. One of the most infamous instances of false memory implantation involved a Wisconsin woman by the name of Nadine Kuhl, who, in 1986, sought psychiatric therapy to deal with a traumatic incident involving her daughter. During sessions, her psychiatrist used hypnosis and other suggestive techniques to dig out buried memories of abuse that Kuhl herself had allegedly experienced. As a result of this, Kuhl became convinced that she had repressed memories of having been in a satanic cult, eating babies, and being forced to watch the murder of her 8-year-old friend. She also came to believe that she had more than 120 personalities. As time passed, Nadine Kuhl eventually realized her memories were implanted by her psychiatrist and successfully sued him for malpractice. One could say she had the last laugh though, because she did win a settlement of $2.4 million. But unlike Kuhl, other victims on this list were not so lucky. Little Albert Experiment. Perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of the Little Albert Experiment is that it didn't achieve much beyond scaring a baby. In the mid-20th century, American psychologist John B. Watson and his graduate student, Rosalie Rayner, decided to carry out a flawed experiment that was to serve as proof of classical conditioning in humans. Watson believed that the fearful response of children to loud noises and sounds was an unconditioned response. He also believed that if a child was taught to associate something they originally did not fear with these sounds, they would eventually come to fear the object. To test out this theory, he selected a 9-month-old child from a hospital. Before the experiment officially began, he exposed the child to a bunch of objects, including a white rat. At first, the baby showed no sign of fear around the rat, but that changed after he was forced to listen to a loud noise whenever he tried to touch the rat. In no time, the baby learned to fear not just the rat, but a bunch of other furry objects as well. Despite the success of his experiment, Watson himself admitted that the child's fearful response was not long-lasting. In the aftermath of the experiment, Watson came under fire for his unethical behavior. Some people speculated that the baby's mother had no idea her son was being forced to participate in such a study. Another issue that came up was whether or not the child Watson and his students spent hours experimenting on was healthy in the first place. Some sources claimed that the infant used in the experiment was very sickly and that he died around 5 years after the experiment. However, these claims have been challenged successfully. Whichever the case, no baby should be intentionally exposed to loud noises over and over again, whether it be for the good of science or not. Stanford Prison Experiment. The Stanford Prison Experiment sounds like a psychologist horror movie plot, only it did happen in real life, to very real people. In the year 1971, Stanford University psychology professor Philip Zimbardo and his team decided to carry out a psychological experiment to see how students would behave in a makeshift prison environment. They put out ads in the local paper offering to pay $15 a day to anyone who volunteered to participate in what they called a psychological study of prison life. Many male students saw the experiment as a way to make some easy money, so they signed up. Unknown to them, things were about to get ugly. After the participants had been selected, they were randomly separated into two groups, guards and prisoners. The guards had one task. They had to keep the prisoners from escaping by any means necessary. So you see where this is going. Things really started to go left on the first day of the experiment when the people who had been assigned prisoner roles were arrested by the local Palo Alto police. For context, the poor guys had no idea this was part of the experiment. By the second day, inmates were full-on rebelling against the guards, and the guards, desperate to hold on to power, didn't hesitate to pull out the big guns. I mean, they didn't pull out actual guns, but they did spray fire extinguishers at the inmates. And then they took all of their clothes and mattresses as punishment. Halfway into day 2, one inmate named Douglas Corpy, aka Prisoner 8612, had what looked to be a mental breakdown. He basically started yelling that he was burning up and that he couldn't bear to spend another night in the makeshift prison, so the organizers let him go. By the 6th day, it had become clear that the whole thing was a mess, and so it was eventually shut down within a week. Also, the findings of the experiment have been called fraudulent and unscientific. Apparently, the guards were given specific instructions on how to act, just so the lead scientist could say his hypothesis was right. Turns out, no one told the guy that that's not how science works. Operation Sea Spray. Time and time again, the US military has proved that they will do just about anything, including conducting biological warfare experiments on civilians. In this case, the US Navy decided to get creative by spraying not one, but 2 dangerous bacteria over the San Francisco Bay Area. Their goal? To see how vulnerable the city might be to a bioweapon attack. In simpler terms, they carried out a bioweapon attack of their own as a test run. The US Navy claimed that the bacteria they released were harmless to humans, but barely 3 weeks after the incident, 11 residents checked into the Stanford Hospital in San Francisco, all suffering from very rare, serious urinary tract infections. 10 of the 11 patients recovered, but the last one was not so lucky. He had recently had a prostate surgery and eventually died of a heart valve infection. Other hospitals in the area, however, did not report receiving visits from people with similar conditions. What they did report was an increase in the cases of pneumonia in the area. And although a clear connection has not been established, you know what they say, if it walks like a duck and talks like a duck. Decades after the incident, the surviving family of the man who died from the heart valve infection filed a lawsuit against the federal government, accusing them for being responsible for his death. Sadly, the court did not rule in their favor because there was no evidence linking the bacteria used in the experiment to the man's death. Stateville Penitentiary Malaria Study. While the price of freedom is often poetically described as courage and sacrifice, for the prisoners of Stateville Penitentiary in Illinois during the 1940s, it came in the form of severe fevers and a willingness to be tested on with experimental substances in a lab. These inmates traded their bodies for a few years off their harsh sentences and received some little financial incentive. They volunteered to take part in one of the most unusual wartime experiments ever devised, the Stateville Penitentiary Malaria Study. At the time, World War II was raging on, and in addition to fighting their enemies, American troops were also battling malaria and losing. For some units, the battle against malaria infections had turned deadlier than the actual war, and so it's easy to see why America was in such a hurry to find a cure. In 1944, and over the course of the following 2 years, more than 400 prisoners at the Stateville Penitentiary were subjects in an experiment aimed at finding an effective drug for malaria. Prisoners taking part in the experiment were infected with a deadly disease and then treated with experimental anti-malaria drugs. The purpose of the experiment wasn't hidden from the subjects, and they were praised for their patriotism. Because nothing says I love my country quite like the willingness to contract a potentially deadly disease with no approved cure. Over the course of the experiments, only one prisoner was reported to have died, suffering a heart attack after several bouts of fever, even though the researchers claimed the death was unrelated to their research. Tearoom trade study. One sure sign that a researcher really messed up is when their work becomes the poster child for unethical social research. That's exactly what happened to the American sociologist Laud Humphreys, the guy behind the Tearoom trade study. The study analyzed men who engaged in anonymous sex in public toilets, a practice that was pretty common in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Depending on what part of the world you lived in, it was either called tea-rooming or cottaging. Tea-rooming typically involved 3 people, and not in the way you're thinking. The third person, who was often referred to as the watch queen, acted as a lookout, while the other 2 got down to business. By offering his services as a watch queen to what I assume was an alarming number of freaky people, Humphreys was able to gather all the data he needed. By the end of the study, Humphreys found that 38% of his test subjects were neither bisexual nor homosexual. 24% were bisexual, 24% were single and in the closet, and only 14% correspond to the popular stereotype of homosexuality, whatever that means. Perhaps the most interesting conclusion drawn from the study was that these encounters were consensual. It proved that gay men weren't lurking in public bathrooms waiting to jump the first straight man in sight, so the police could turn their attention to investigating actual crimes. So why did Humphreys come under fire? To put it simply, he lied to his test subjects about his intentions and his identity. He also didn't seek their consent beforehand. As if that wasn't enough, he used their license plate numbers to track them down so he could conduct follow-up interviews, during which he, once again, lied about their identity and intentions. Tier 2. Project Artichoke. You know how the movies portray the CIA as a bunch of government agents in really cool suits who operate mostly undercover to save the day? Or wait, was that just Men in Black? Anyway, it turns out that the CIA isn't as cool as you think. In the 1900s, they were up to all kinds of crazy stuff, and Project Artichoke is arguably the craziest of them all. Okay, maybe not the craziest, but it's somewhere in the top 10. Project Artichoke was a mind control program designed to gather as much information as possible about a bunch of dark stuff by any means necessary. One part of the project was geared towards finding the most brutal and effective interrogation techniques, and let's just say the agents in charge tried it all, from hypnosis and total isolation to forced use of hard drugs. Nothing was off the table. Speaking of hard drugs, that was another huge aspect of Project Artichoke. Agents were known to experiment with cocaine, marijuana, heroin, peyote, and mescaline. The experiments often involved unwilling participants, and if the rumors are to be believed, not even CIA agents were safe. One source reports that CIA agents who had no idea what was going on were given LSD for days on end, just so the higher-ups could study the drug's effects on unsuspecting people. One agent in particular was said to have been kept on LSD for a total of 77 days. Project Artichoke officially ran for about 2 years and finally came to an end in 1953, but the CIA was nowhere near done playing with this fire, or in this case, dangerous interrogation techniques. Project MKUltra. If you thought the CIA somehow turned over a leaf after Project Artichoke, the joke's on you, because if anything, things actually got worse. In the same year that Project Artichoke ended, Project MKUltra began with pretty much the same evil objectives. Only this time, the experiments were carried out on a much larger scale. The CIA was still very much interested in finding drugs that could be used during interrogations to weaken their captives, force confessions, and brainwash their enemies. You know, all that good stuff. To achieve this goal, CIA officials began to source test subjects from not just America, but dear old Canada as well. It didn't take very long before the people in charge of Project MKUltra began to try out other ways to get exactly what they wanted. They started experimenting with hypnosis, electroshocks, sensory deprivation, isolation, verbal and sexual abuse, and just about every other form of torture. The truth about Project MKUltra came to light in 1975 when the Church Committee, a U.S. Senate Select Committee, not a group of priests in case you are wondering, decided to spill the beans on the CIA's questionable activities. When he realized what was coming, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered that all MKUltra files be destroyed. So, even though we have all these horrifying details, we still know next to nothing about what really went down. Operation Midnight Climax. Technically speaking, Operation Midnight Climax was a subproject of Project MKUltra, but it deserves its own spot on this list, and you're about to see why. No, it's not just because it has a really cool name, which, by the way, is the only cool thing about it. Operation Midnight Climax had a pretty straightforward mission: to study the effects of LSD on non-consenting individuals, aka unsuspecting civilians who had no idea what the hell was going on. The scientist in charge also wanted to see what would happen if sex was thrown into the mix. So the CIA gathered together a bunch of sex workers that were on the organization's payroll. Why did the CIA workers have sex workers on its payroll in the first place, you may ask? Well, your guess is as good as mine. All the girls had to do was bring their unsuspecting clients back to any of the approved CIA safe houses and secretly make them ingest LSD. Next, the girls would begin asking the victims deep personal questions to see if the mixture of LSD and the other activity had scrambled their brains enough for them to spill their secrets without realizing it. Did I mention that the CIA officials would watch the entire thing in real time because they had one-way glass set up all around the safe house? In addition to trying to get their victims to spill their guts, the CIA also attempted to implant hidden instructions in the minds of said victims. They also tried to use mind control on the unsuspecting civilians and make them do crazy stuff. And I mean like bad crazy. So things like robbery, assault, and assassination. Montauk Project. Depending on who you ask, the Montauk Project either did or didn't happen. The US government denies carrying out any such experiment, but a couple of people swear that it actually happened. So I'll let you be the judge of that. The Montauk Project allegedly took place at Camp Hero in Montauk, New York. There, kids were reportedly hooked up to wires in hidden underground labs for secret government experiments on mind control, time travel, wormholes, and teleportation. Basically, every sci-fi plot rolled into one. The rumors started in 1992, 11 years after the military base at Camp Hero was shut down. Some people even recall being subjects for cruel experiments at the site. One of such people is 57-year-old Lafreno, who grew up in the Montauk area and now, ironically, works as a parks employee at Camp Hero. He sincerely believes he was one of the lost and tortured Montauk Project boys. Apparently, he had suppressed the memories of his time there until age 51, when he was hypnotized into recalling everything. After being hypnotized, Lafreno suddenly remembered being abducted and abused during the summer of 1980, when he was 12 or 13 years old. According to him, he and other boys were being brought underground through one of the sealed gunneries left from World War II. He also recalled lying on a table with wires coming out of him, like electrodes. There were up to 50 kids, according to him, some of whom were later executed. Now, it would be easy to write Lafreno off as bunkers, except he had visited one of the locations from his hypnosis session with another employee, and there, they found remnants of the sunken house from his visions. 3 other men also claimed they were brainwashed and forced against their will to take part in experiments at Camp Hero between 1971 and 1983, with one of them saying the government agents use electromagnetic waves to plant thoughts in people's heads. Vipeholm Experiments. This is the first of many evil experiments on this list that involves a bunch of vulnerable kids being taken advantage of. In the 1930s, studies conducted in Sweden found that young children in the country had cavities in 83% of their teeth. Since there was no form of treatment at the time, rotting teeth had to be pulled off, which was far from a satisfactory solution. To make things worse, experts were uncertain of what was causing so much dental decay. To find out, the Swedish government commissioned a study on the role of diets and sweets in tooth decay. Ironically, the study was also funded by the sugar industry. Now, all that was left was to find willing participants, or a group of people who would have absolutely no idea what they were being forced to participate in. Somehow, the second option seemed more appealing to the researchers, and so they decided to perform the study at Vipeholm Mental Institution near Lund, Sweden. The institution was home to children with severe intellectual and developmental disabilities. At the beginning of the study, the children's teeth were found to be in much better shape than the rest of the Swedish populace. But this didn't last much longer. For the first 2 years, the subjects were given a low-starch diet that included supplements and fluoride tablets. They were also not allowed snacks between meals, and their dental health was closely monitored. The result of the first phase were pretty good, but the second phase was where things took a turn for the worse. In the next 2 years, the researchers added twice the average amount of sugar to the children's diets and divided them into 3 separate groups. The first group was given sugar-loaded sticky bread, while the second group took in their sugar by drinking it in beverages. The third group, however, was made to eat sticky candy between each of their meals and consumed 8 to 24 pieces of candy in each sitting. While the first 2 groups didn't experience significant adverse effects, the third set, unsurprisingly, had the worst of it. The candy stuck to their teeth and caused them to rot, even turning black in some cases. The researchers repaired the damaged teeth of some of the children by pulling them out, which isn't really repairing if you think about it. But the children with more severe health conditions were left to suffer the terrible pain of rotten teeth for the rest of their lives. The Monster Study. In 1939, a university professor by the name of Wendell Johnson decided to play Dr. Frankenstein with a group of vulnerable orphans. When the professor was just a kid, his schoolteacher had mentioned to his parents that he was starting to stutter. Even though he had spoken just fine up until that point, he began to worry about the teacher's comment and soon found himself stuttering. As a result of this experience, Johnson developed a theory later in his life suggesting that stuttering could be taught or acquired. Now, all he had to do was test it out. Since no sane parent or guardian would volunteer their child for an experiment that might turn them into stutterers, Professor Johnson had to get creative. He decided to experiment on kids who didn't have anyone to object, orphans. This plan horrified the professor's colleagues so much that they dubbed the experiment the Monster Study. I guess Johnson's lack of ethical boundaries just didn't have a nice enough ring to it. The experiment took place at the Iowa Soldiers' Orphans Home, and the kids were split into 4 groups with 6 members each. 2 groups were made up of children who had been previously identified as stutterers, while the other 2 consisted of children who spoke just fine. One group that stuttered received praise for their speech, while the kids who were fluent were heavily criticized and labeled stutterers. After the treatment endured, 5 out of the 6 children who did not stutter at the beginning of the study began stuttering. Of the 5 who were already stutterers, 3 became worse. Once they realized what they had done, Professor Johnson and his team tried to rectify the damage, but its impact on the kids was permanent. The children started exhibiting low self-esteem and adopting the self-conscious behaviors associated with stutterers. Tier 3. Baltimore Lead Paint Study. Early on in modern science, people figured out lead was toxic, especially to children. Notwithstanding, lead paint stuck around for ages. It wasn't until 1951 that Baltimore decided to ban it in new homes. Despite the ban, many properties that were painted with lead remained standing, especially in low-income neighborhoods. So it became important to figure out a way to remove the lead and make the homes habitable again. And this is where things get ugly. The Kennedy Krieger Institute, a branch of Johns Hopkins associated with childcare, decided to step in and investigate. They intended to find the most cost-effective way to get rid of the lead. To do so, they secured a total of 107 houses with lead paint and divided them into groups. Each group received a different level of lead removal treatment using different techniques. And then, the next step was to find families with children to live in the homes. You see, the scientists intended to measure how effective each treatment was by examining the children to see how much lead they had in their system. Since not many people would eagerly sign up for such a risky study, the scientists kept the families in the dark about the full details. Unfortunately, by the time the study came to an end, many of the participants had developed neurological disabilities. In the aftermath of the cruel experiment, the Kennedy Krieger Institute came under fire. In 2001, a class action lawsuit for deliberate exposure and negligence was filed against the institute, and the Johns Hopkins Internal Review Board was widely criticized for allowing the study to proceed in the first place. Willowbrook Hepatitis Study. If there's one thing you'll learn as this video progresses, it's that in the past, scientists absolutely loved carrying out dangerous experiments on vulnerable children. One of such experiments was the Willowbrook Hepatitis Study. The study took place at the Willowbrook State School, which was, at the time, the biggest state-run institution for people with mental disabilities in the U.S. The institution was opened up in the late 1940s, and by the early 1950s, the students were facing a hepatitis outbreak. At first, the disease was being spread naturally, but then the New York School of Medicine, led by Dr. Saul Krugman, decided to interfere. Like with many other meddling scientists the world has seen, these ones were up to no good. They began to intentionally infect previously healthy students with the hepatitis virus, just so they could track the development of the viral infection and potentially develop a vaccine. The children who participated in the study were said to be between the ages of 3 and 10, so it didn't take long for the inhumane nature of the experiment to come to light. When people asked questions about the morality of their actions, Dr. Krugman's team simply shrugged their shoulders and claimed that since there was already a hepatitis outbreak in the institution, the students would have been infected regardless. They also tried to justify their actions by saying if they did succeed in finding a cure, the children would benefit from it. Tuskegee Syphilis Study. Another deadly disease for which a cure needed to be found at the cost of barbaric human experiments. Syphilis. The Tuskegee experiment began in 1932, at a time when there was no known cure for the venereal disease. After being recruited under the false promise of free medical care, 600 African-American men in Macon County, Alabama, were enrolled in the experiment, which aimed to study the full progression of syphilis. The participants were mainly illiterate farmers who had never visited a doctor before. They consisted of a group of 399 men with latent syphilis, and a control group of 201 others who were free of the disease. But all they knew was that they were being treated for bad blood, which was a term commonly used at the time to refer to a variety of disorders. The men were monitored by health workers, but were only given placebos, even though penicillin became the recommended treatment for syphilis 15 years into the 40-year-long study. Local doctors were even convinced not to offer the subjects any form of treatment at all, in order for researchers to track the full progression of the disease. To this effect, no effective care was provided as the men died, went blind, or even insane due to the untreated disease. The medical personnel just stood back and watched everything unfold, taking down notes. The researchers initially intended to keep tracking the participants until all had died, so autopsies could be performed and the project data analyzed. But news of the project broke in 1972, prompting public outrage and forcing the study to finally shut down. By this time, 28 subjects had already died from syphilis. 100 more had passed away from related complications. At least 40 spouses had been diagnosed with it, and the disease had been passed to 19 African-American children at birth. The surviving participants, along with the heirs of those who died, went to court and received $10 million in an out-of-court settlement. Guatemalan Syphilis Study. Another experiment with syphilis, except this time the subjects were perfectly healthy individuals who had no business contracting such an awful disease. The Guatemala syphilis experiments were human experiments led by the USA and conducted in Guatemala from 1946 to 1948, involving the deliberate infection of 1,500 Guatemalan men, women, and children with syphilis. And this is the sick part. The study was co-sponsored by the US and Guatemalan governments. Interestingly, it was led by physician Dr. John Charles Cutler, who was also involved in the Tuskegee syphilis experiment on African-American men in Alabama. U.S. Public Health Service researchers infected people in Guatemala with syphilis, gonorrhea, and cancroid. This included soldiers, orphans, inmates, and hookers, all infected with the diseases without their informed consents. Bacteria that caused the STDs were administered to the unsuspecting individuals in the form of a pinprick vaccination or a pill. The researchers were said to have systematically and repeatedly violated the vulnerable individuals. The study was intended to test chemicals that could prevent the spread of the disease, but only 700 of the infected people received treatment. In total, 5,500 people were involved in all research experiments, 83 of whom died by the end of 1953. Skid Row Cancer Study. In the 1950s, a urologist named Barry Hudson developed an interest in prostate cancer. He had just discovered that there was next to no information about the disease or its treatment, and so he decided to do something about it. Hudson decided to carry out a study, and to do that, he needed volunteers. The only problem was that the methods of diagnosis he intended to use were untested and had several side effects, so educated people were very unlikely to volunteer. To get the participants he needed, Hudson made his way to a low-income neighborhood in Manhattan. He approached over 1,000 homeless men and offered them food, shelter, and free medical care in exchange for their participation. In a not at all surprising turn of events, the homeless men jumped at the offer. The few of them who had reservations were assured by Hudson that his methods were perfectly safe and harmless. Only he was lying. Hudson searched for signs of prostate cancer in his test subjects by performing biopsies on them, and as a result, many of them went on to suffer long-term health consequences that ranged from impotence and rectal laceration to diminishing sexual function. When people questioned him about the unethical nature of his research methods, Hudson said he had no regrets whatsoever. He claimed that the volunteers seemed fully aware of the aspects involved in the study, even though he had not provided them with any such information. Perhaps the worst part of Hudson's cancer experiment is that, owing to a bunch of technical reasons, his research didn't provide that much useful information. The Aversion Project. During the apartheid, a bunch of psychologists, in collaboration with top officials in the South African Defense Force, got it into their heads that they could somehow cure homosexuality. And that's how the Aversion Project came to be. At the time, the South African military was down bad. And so, even though being attracted to someone of the same gender was considered a mental illness, they couldn't afford to outrightly ban gay people from joining the army. They did, however, ban them from becoming permanent members of the military and refused to share any sensitive information with them. Worst of all, people suspected of being homosexuals were subjected to horrifying treatment under the guise of receiving therapy. By horrifying treatments, I mean compulsion shock therapy, chemical castration, and just about every other thing that counts as a human right violation. During the shock therapy sessions, psychologists actually tried to shock people out of being attracted to others of the same gender, literally. When that didn't work, which of course it didn't, they turned to something even more sinister. They began performing sexual realignment procedures, which is pretty much the same as gender-affirming surgery. The cruel experiments were conducted on both men and women, and they went on for decades, until it was finally established that homosexuality was not a form of mental illness. In 1995, at least 2 decades after it was established that the Aversion Project was nothing but a medical torture program, the South African Medical Association issued a public apology for past wrongdoings. Because, that's helpful. As far as consequences go, there weren't exactly many of those. In 1995, Aubrey Levin, the psychologist who led the program, moved to Canada and acquired a license to practice medicine. He went on to become the professor of clinical psychiatry at the University of Calgary. But the story was far from over. In 2010, Levin was taken into custody for sexual assault of a patient. Subsequently, around 30 men came out to say that they were assaulted by Levin during counseling. Levin was tried and convicted for his crimes, sentenced to 5 years in prison, and his medical license was suspended. Testicular Transplants. Like many of the experiments on this list, this one starts out with an underqualified doctor finding himself in a position of power. In the year 1913, Leo Leonidas Stanley was appointed chief surgeon of the San Quentin State Prison, despite having no surgical experience. This meant he was the boss, and he didn't have to answer to anyone. What Stanley lacked in surgical experience, he made up for in questionable and, quite frankly, dangerous beliefs. For example, he believed that diseases were the cause of crime, and that testicular transplants were the key to remaining young forever. So you see where this is going. As soon as he got comfortable in his shiny new office, Stanley began to carry out testicular transplants. He would transplant the testicles of executed prisoners to other living inmates, and whenever he couldn't secure human testicles, he would simply improvise. By improvise, I mean Dr. Stanley didn't mind attaching the testicles of animals like goats, boars, and deers to his living patients. In fact, he believed that his testicular transplants had the potential to cure depression, asthma, acne, and mental depravity. A little over 2 decades later, Stanley had performed over 10,000 testicular implants in San Quentin. But he wasn't a one cruel experiment kind of guy, so he had also ventured into sterilization. Stanley encouraged inmates at the prison to volunteer themselves to be sterilized because he believed stopping convicted offenders from having kids would drastically reduce crime rates. Speaking of reducing crime rates, Stanley was also known to perform plastic surgery on inmates. According to his very flawed logic, enhancing the inmate's appearance would increase their chances of finding honest work, and this would in turn keep them from committing crime. I wasn't crazy when I said the guy had some pretty crazy beliefs. Tier 4. Kamera Experiment. Back in the 20th century, before the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the Soviet Secret Services operated a covert research facility that manufactured and tested poisons. It was known by a few different names, the coolest of which was Kamera, meaning the cell in Russian. Not that there is anything cool about manufacturing poison in a lab. On February 20, 1939, the poison lab became known as Laboratory 1 and was headed by Grigory Maryanovsky. Maryanovsky and his colleagues tested various lethal poisons, including mustard gas, ricin, and cyanide on, you guessed it, unsuspecting prisoners. The team of researchers had one objective during these experiments: They wanted to identify a tasteless, odorless chemical that could not be detected even after the victim's demise. Candidate poisons were disguised as medicines and administered to the victims along with a meal or drink. All that evil eventually paid off, as the Russians did find what they were looking for. A concoction with the desired qualities was developed and referred to as C2. According to testimonies from witnesses, the victims experienced physical changes, such as a rapid weakening and reduction in height, followed by a calm demeanor, which eventually resulted in the death of the victim within 15 minutes. Interestingly, the victims included prominent individuals too, like the president of a certain country and a Nobel Prize laureate. Blood coagulation experiment. It would be impossible to talk about diabolic, unethical experiments on humans without mentioning Nazi Germany. They started a war and were willing to go to any length to win it, including using the civilian prisoners as lab rats. As you can imagine, Nazi scientists were as brilliant as they were evil. They created a substance that could potentially aid blood clotting and reduce bleeding from gunshot wounds sustained during combat. Before this wonderful substance could be handed over to soldiers, the scientists had to assess its effectiveness and ensure that it was safe for human consumption. Of course, that's where things got ugly. The people in charge didn't think twice about picking up some random prisoner to test out the substance. Subjects were given the substance as a tablet and then shot through the neck or chest. Other times, they were dismembered without anesthesia and left to bleed out. The scientists also injected subjects with blood types that didn't match theirs, just so they could gain more insight into the science of the interaction between different blood types. When the Nazi scientists decided to draw blood from a prisoner, it was pretty much a death sentence, because they often entered a major artery, causing the subject to die from major blood loss. Seawater Experiments. The next evil experiment took place in Dachau concentration camp, which, when you think about it, kind of makes sense, since Dachau was not only one of the first concentration camps built by Nazi Germany, but also had the unfortunate honor of being the longest-running one. In July 1944, a particularly evil physician named Hans Eppinger Jr. and his colleagues took it upon themselves to somehow find a way to make seawater drinkable. At first, it sounds like a noble cause, but of course, they had to hurt people in the process. Hans and his team put together a group of 90 gypsies and forced them to drink nothing but filtered seawater. They denied the group access to food and any other form of sustenance, forcing them to make do with seawater and nothing else. In a matter of days, the gypsies got so dehydrated that they began to lick freshly mopped floors just to get some drinkable water. A man who worked in Dachau during the time of this experiment revealed that he witnessed the gypsies become so desperate they resorted to squeezing old floor rags in the hope of extracting a few drops of water. The man also said that even though he really wanted to help, he was powerless to do so, because at the time, people were getting killed just for witnessing the experiments, let alone trying to interfere. It's unclear whether any of the gypsies lost their lives during the experiment, but it's safe to say that those who survived were left with lifelong injuries. Auschwitz Twin Experiments. There lived a sadistic Nazi doctor by the name of Josef Mengele, and he was obsessed with identical twins. While he was stationed at the Auschwitz concentration camp, he enlisted the help of Nazi soldiers in finding twins. Around 3,000 twins were pulled from the millions of prisoners, most of them being kids, but only 200 survived to tell the tale. After the twins had been snatched away from their parents, they were immediately taken to clean up. Since they were Mengele's children, they got treated much better than the other prisoners at Auschwitz, until the gory experiment started at least. Each twin had to have blood drawn every day, and they underwent various medical experiments. Mengele kept his motivations to himself, and so not even the kids understood why they were being injected with different substances. Each pair of twins were forced to undress and lie next to each other, so their anatomy could be examined and compared. Features that were the same between the two were deemed hereditary, while those that were different were thought to be environmental. Mengele also attempted to fabricate blue eye color by putting drops of chemicals into their eyes, which often caused severe pain, infections, and permanent blindness. And things only got worse from there for Mengele's subjects. In some cases, one twin would intentionally be infected with diseases like tuberculosis and typhus, while the other would be left healthy. While the sick twin eventually died, the other was killed to examine and compare the effects of the disease on the pair. Various surgeries, including organ removal, castration, and amputation, were also performed without anesthesia. The autopsies were the final phases of the experiment, They were carried out on twins who had died from the experiments or who had been killed just for after-death measurements and examination. During the autopsies, some of the twins' organs were harvested and sent to an equally sociopathic colleague of Mengele for further study. Freezing experiments. In 1941, the Luftwaffe warfare branch conducted experiments in hope of finding an effective method to prevent and treat hypothermia. The experiments were carried out on male prisoners to simulate the freezing conditions German soldiers suffered on the Eastern Front. The German forces were not at all prepared for the bitter cold, and thousands of their soldiers froze to death or were incapacitated by cold injuries. The experiments had two objectives. First, to establish how long it would take to lower the body temperature to death, and second, to determine how best to resuscitate a frozen victim. One study placed prisoners naked in the open air for several hours with temperatures as low as -6 degrees Celsius, and it only took a few hours for many to start screaming in pain as their bodies turned frozen solid. The experimenters assessed the physical effects of cold exposure and explored different methods of rewarming those that managed to survive. It is said that some victims were thrown into boiling water in an attempt to revive them. Prisoners were also forced to sit in tanks of freezing water for up to 3 hours. And after the subjects were frozen, they underwent different trial methods for rewarming, a process during which many died. There were up to 400 experiments, and somewhere between 280 to 300 victims, which means that some poor victims suffered more than one experiment. Human vivisections of Herophilus. The Germans weren't the only ones whose quest for medical knowledge took a dark and gory turn. Famously regarded as one of the fathers of anatomy, ancient Greek physician Herophilus made significant discoveries in human anatomy during his practice. You've probably heard of the guy. What you don't know is that there's a dark side to his methods. Herophilus spent most of his life practicing medicines in Alexandria, Egypt. He initially started out dissecting cadavers, but he later switched things up. At a point in ancient Egypt, under the leadership of Ptolemy I and Ptolemy II, prisoners were sentenced to undergo vivisections. A vivisection is the practice of operating on living organisms, in this case, humans, for experimental purposes. And who better to carry out this procedure than the greatest anatomist of the generation? Herophilus performed public vivisections on an estimated 600 living prisoners, and as a result, made great strides in the study of human anatomy, especially the brain, eyes, liver, and body systems. Surgical experiments on slaves. Up next is yet another revered scientist who attained his status at the expense of people's lives, except his own subjects were not condemned prisoners, but African American female slaves. Widely regarded as the father of modern gynecology, Dr. Marion Sims gained much of his fame and expertise from carrying out gruesome experimental surgeries on slave women. He earned his title after his experiments on at least 7 enslaved black women and girls in Montgomery between 1845 and 1849 that helped him develop a technique to repair a chronic complication of childbirth in women called vesicovaginal fistula. Operating without any form of anesthesia, the potentially life-threatening experiments caused excruciating pain. But Sims legally only needed permission from the owners of these enslaved victims. One famous case was his experiment on a slave named Lucy in the presence of other doctors who only observed. Sims' multiple experiments on Lucy were unsuccessful and nearly killed her with severe blood poisoning. Nonetheless, he continued to perform his procedures on female slaves, sometimes drugging them only so they could not fight back. Project 4.1. It's one thing to use vulnerable individuals for experiments, but using a whole country as lab rats? That's an entirely different ballgame, one that the US likes to play apparently. Under Project 4.1, a secret US medical program implemented in 1954, American scientists were studying the effects of radiation on the people of the Marshall Islands without their knowledge or consent. On March 1st, 1954, the United States detonated a thermonuclear bomb on Bikini Atoll in the Marshall Islands. The US military did not evacuate the islands near the test site before setting off the bomb, and even after it went off, they waited days to do the needful. This delay was so they could study the effects of the bomb's radiation on the Marshallese. Hundreds of Marshallese on other affected islands were never even evacuated, and as a result were exposed to dangerous radiation for a long period of time. Meanwhile, the United States committed their resources to studying the aftermath instead, and even knowingly sent Marshallese back to contaminated islands, telling them it was safe. According to testimonies, US scientists went as far as making Marshallese drink radioactive liquids, after which they took painful bone marrow samples and extracted their teeth to measure their radiation uptake. The most affected group of islands was Rongelap Atoll, with its inhabitants suffering from acute radiation sickness, high rates of thyroid abnormalities, and even cancer. Babies were born that resembled jellyfish. They had beating hearts but no bones. Today, cancer remains a leading cause of death in the Marshall Islands. Tier 5. Cincinnati Radiation Experiments. In the 1960s and 70s, Cincinnati became the unlikely stage for a chilling experiment that could have been pulled right out of a dystopian novel. Only this time, America decided it would be fun to test radiation on their own people. The Cincinnati Radiation Experiments were a series of body irradiation tests performed on at least 90 patients with advanced cancer at the Cincinnati General Hospital from 1960 to 1971. These experiments were partly funded by an agency within the Department of Defense to study how soldiers would be affected by large doses of radiation, information they imagined would come in handy in the likely event of a nuclear war. But the patients had no idea that they were doing their country a costly service. All they were told was that they would be receiving an experimental cancer treatment, which, when you think about it, was sort of a half-truth, as radiation is indeed used to kill cancerous cells. The experiments administered between 25 and 300 rads of cobalt-60 irradiation within a few hours, which was the equivalent to around 20,000 chest x-rays. They also had plans of increasing the radiation dosage to 600 rad, but the scientists didn't want their subjects to die before the end of the experiment, so they came up with brutal ways to reduce the negative effects of the radiation exposure. Or at least, they tried to. The irradiated patients experienced several side effects, including vomiting, diarrhea, hemorrhaging, cognitive impairment, and hallucinations. In the first 2 months alone, a quarter of the patients died. Within a year, over 3/4 of the patients were dead. The researchers did, however, conveniently claim that cancer was the primary factor in the deaths of the subjects. Holmesburg Prison Experiments. When you think about evil doctors, there's a high chance dermatologists don't come to mind. But that's about to change. Albert Montgomery Kligman is well known for his role in the invention of the acne medication Retin-A. What you didn't know is that he was as evil as it gets. Kligman took an interest in dermatology early on in his career. He wanted to find cures for all kinds of skin conditions, as well as develop new products that would make waves in the beauty industry. So when he set foot in Holmesburg Prison in the 1950s, it was the answer to all his twisted prayers. Before he even got clearance from the prison authorities, Kligman began to offer inmates small amounts of money in exchange for volunteering to be his human test subjects, and many of them agreed. When the inmates asked if they would be hurt during the experiments, Kligman and his team assured them that it was perfectly safe. But this couldn't have been farther from the truth. As the experiments progressed, inmates were injected with, forced to apply, and made to ingest questionable substances. One victim recalls being made to ingest milkshakes that caused him to develop hemorrhoids later in life, and another reported that his skin felt like leather for months after being exposed to some kind of radiation. The more he settled in, the more terrifying Kligman's methods became. In no time, he was exposing inmates to dangerous contaminants like dioxin, and intentionally infecting them with pathogens that could cause infections like herpes and staphylococcus. At some point, he even began to test out psychoactive drugs for the Department of Defense. Years after the experiments ended, Kligman's victims banded together and tried to sue his team for damages. But the statute of limitations had expired, so the lawsuit was dismissed. Unit 731, Vivisections. As it turns out, the Germans weren't the only ones to take their war prisoners to the lab. During the Second Sino-Japanese War and World War II, the secret biological and chemical warfare research unit of the Imperial Japanese Army also engaged in lethal human experimentation and biological weapons manufacturing. In Unit 731, vivisections were pretty much an everyday affair. Thousands of men, women, kids, and babies who had been taken as Japanese prisoners of war were subjected to these live dissections, often performed without anesthesia and with very low chances of survival. Vivisections were typically performed on prisoners after intentionally infecting them with various diseases. The organs affected by the disease would then be extracted as a way to study the effects of the disease on the human body. Prisoners also had their limbs amputated, simply because the Japanese wanted to study blood loss. Limbs removed were sometimes reattached to the opposite side of victims' bodies for reasons we would probably never understand. Some prisoners had their stomachs surgically removed, and that's not even the worst of it. An Imperial Japanese Army surgeon at the time estimated that at least 1,000 Japanese personnel were involved in the practice of vivisections in mainland China. He even admitted that when he performed the operations on captives, it was more for the purpose of practice than it was for research. He also stated that the vivisections were routine among Japanese doctors stationed in China during the war. In a nutshell, all that human dissection was mostly for practice, and not at all for the good of science. Unit 731 Biowarfare Experiments. Away from vivisections, Unit 731 was also involved in the development and testing of biological weapons capable of spreading deadly disease. These biological weapons were to be used against the Chinese population during World War II, but the scientists first had to make sure that they were potent. In 1939, a combat medic officer named General Shiro Ishii boiled down his laboratory discoveries to 6 potent pathogens: anthrax, typhoid, paratyphoid, glanders, dysentery, and plague-infected human fleas. By every indication, these pathogens were potent enough to start epidemics on their own, and now all the general had to do was conduct trials on a group of unsuspecting civilians. In record time, he came up with a few sinister but effective ways to spread the biological agents. The general had one goal: to unleash hell on Earth, and he knew just how to go about it. One of his methods involved the use of bombs containing live rats and fleas infected with diseases. These bombs were designed to explode mid-air, ensuring the safe landing of the infected creatures to the ground. As diabolical as this method sounds, it was just one out of many. The second method involved using low-flying airplanes to spread plague-infected fleas over Chinese cities, including coastal Ningbo and Changde, Henan province in 1940 and 1941. These operations caused bubonic plague epidemics, killing tens of thousands. Another expedition to Nanjing involved spreading typhoid and paratyphoid germs by introducing them into the wells, marshes, and houses in the city, as well as infusing them in snacks distributed to the local Chinese. To the pleasure of the Japanese scientists, deadly epidemics broke out shortly after, which led to the conclusion that paratyphoid fever was the most effective of the pathogens. At least 12 large-scale bioweapon field trials were carried out, and at least 11 Chinese cities were attacked with biological agents, causing mass casualties. Unit 731, Frostbite Testing. If you thought you had heard the worst of Unit 731, you might want to think again. The scientists there replaced Germany's freezing experiments with their frostbite testing, only it was more horrifying. Army engineer Hisato Yoshimura conducted freezing experiments by taking captives outside, dipping various limbs in waters of sub-zero temperatures, and allowing them to freeze. Yoshimura would then strike their frozen limbs with a short stick and watch the ice being chipped away. The man was so evil that even his literal partners in crime, all of whom were war criminals like him, began calling him the devil. Other military personnel of the unit referred to Yoshimura as the Satan of science and called him a cold-blooded animal. Yoshimura earned those colorful nicknames because of his involvement in mass killings and inhumane scientific tests, including soaking the fingers of a 3-day-old child in water containing ice and salt. As you probably already guessed, Yoshimura didn't stop at freezing the limbs of his prisoners. It is also said he once put 2 naked men in an area 40 to 50 degrees below zero and filmed the whole process until the subjects died. Yoshimura did eventually develop a resistance index of frostbite based on the mean body temperature at different phases during his experiments, but at the cost of unimaginable human suffering and many deaths. Unit 731. Everything in between. As we have already established, the researchers at Unit 731 were as evil as it gets, so it shouldn't come as a surprise that one of their favorite pastimes was taking advantage of the Chinese women in captivity and forcing them to get pregnant. The twisted rationale behind this was that they needed to observe the mother and child to see if certain diseases could be vertically passed down. Although many children were successfully born in captivity there have been no accounts of any survivors of Unit 731. Children included. Since the men couldn't exactly bear children, they were subjected to another kind of terror. Many male prisoners, and some females, were used in weapon testing experiments, which, by the way, were as brutal as the name suggests. The prisoners were used as human targets to test the efficiency of grenades, flamethrowers, and other dangerous weapons. Some were intentionally exposed to bomb blasts just so the researchers could figure out the best way to treat bomb survivors. That's all the human experiments we have for today. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and remember, if a researcher offers you an incentive that seems too good to be true for you to be part of their study, don't do it.